We're here with Dr. Joseph Marbach, who is president of Georgian Court University, the former provost at LaSalle University, and a former professor of political science and dean at Seton Hall University. He worked with at the Center for the Study of Federalism for years, and also is currently a fellow at the Center for the Study of Federalism. So he's been very integrally involved over the years with Cities of the Prairie and also with the work of Daniel Elazar. So welcome.
Thank you, Wes. It's a pleasure to join you and your students.
Great. So I was wondering if you just kind of give us an introduction about the importance of Daniel Elazar's work to political science and to public administration, and where this whole Cities of the Prairie thing fits into that.
Sure. Well, without a doubt, Dan Elazar was the preeminent political scientist in the study of federalism and state and local governments. And again, he took a broader view of federalism that encompassed intergovernmental relations. So it was that public administration side that some of your students might be interested in, but it was also looking at other aspects of political culture that would influence state-federal relations, interstate relations, state-local relations. So he just took a very broad approach to what has been state of American federalism, and wrote probably what is the seminal work on American federalism, A View from the States, that really has stood the test of time, and really is the guide work of the development of American federalism, and how it's actually been applied over different cycles of the American political system's life.
Excellent. So you were involved in the Cities of the Prairie, your dissertation. You were involved with researching and writing and editing. Can you tell us a little bit about the project and kind of the importance of the project?
Sure. The project originates in the 1960s when Professor Elazar was actually a faculty member out in Illinois, actually close to his home state of Minnesota. And so really what was happening in American studies and in American community studies were these elite versus pluralism studies. So a whole debate over who controlled the city, who had power, what were the sources of power. And there was just a debate, was it an elite that controlled everything in a community, or was it more pluralistic? And depending on your political orientation, you'd look at a community and you might study it from the top down or the bottom up and reach your conclusions based on that. What Dan Elazar thought was that it wasn't enough to just look at one community. That his major criticism of those kinds of studies by Robert Dahl on one side and by some of the more elitist folks on the other was that they were doing a snapshot in time. And so their conclusions may have been accurate for that particular period of time. But over the life cycle of a community, we really needed to know the ebb and flow of power. And in addition, why look at just one community? So if we were going to look at a community over time, let's look at several communities and compare and contrast the power arrangements, the participation rates, the just governmental structures that would develop and influence each of those cities at different times. And even the economy, you could overlay many different factors as you factored in over time. So the Cities of the Prairie became a multi-generational study of multiple cities, 10 in all by the time the study really got underway and was published back in the, 1970s when Cities of the Prairies came out.
Would you say it's fair to, comparing to Dahl and to C. Wright Mills and all those people, was it fair that he added the extra level of intergovernmental relations that probably wasn't as big? That was, in addition to what you've already said, is that a big part of what Cities of the Prairie is about?
Sure, without a doubt. He wanted to look at the community in its environment. So elements of relations with the state government, relations with the federal government, relations with other governments within the community itself. Um, you know, part of those early community studies never took into account that, in fact, there are multiple jurisdictions in a particular geographic region. So you'll deal with the city proper, but there will be school districts to deal with. There'll be fire districts to deal with, other types of special districts. There's often a county overlay that provides services and collects taxes. You have the state, and then you have the federal government. So part of what LSR was really seeking to do is understand the community within the total environment. And then that was also where the notion of a civil community starts to develop. So for Elazar, the community he was studying didn't end necessarily at the city boundaries, but the surrounding communities around it would have an influence. Those other overlapping jurisdictions would have some influence over the life of that civil community. Just for example, so in one community, the school district might be the most important player because that's what was emphasized by the values of that community. So the real power might not be in city government. It might have been on the school board, which had control over taxes and control over the education of a community, and hence impacted land values and housing values, and the quality of life in a community, because you had great school systems, and that's what drove the identity of a community. So he added multiple dimensions to what he really found as a unsatisfactory set of community studies to that point.
How would we know a good civil community when we saw it?
Well, good question, and not one that's really clear to define. So Dan did attempt to define it. He developed a research guide for it. So, and again, part of dissatisfaction of how we label communities might have been, Census Bureau tracts and statistical areas that the Census Bureau identified. Dan never really liked that approach because they might have been too wide, or they might not have been wide enough. So really, you really have to get into the community and do the background types of research. You have to read the local newspapers. You read the city government. You learn about any historical documents, if there are books or other studies about a community, just to learn who are the influencers and what other communities or jurisdictions would influence that particular community. So it wasn't the city, but it was certainly the surrounding, often suburban communities that influenced it, because you had people that lived in one community and worked in another, and you'd look at those kinds of transactional measures to see what really tied up a community.
Now, he tended to think that some types of communities might be better than others, so he kind of shied away from the big cities as being good and didn't want it too small. Why does he kind of like these medium-sized cities?
Well, part of that is where the economics comes in, and you really run into an economy of scale at a community of, I guess if you got around 250,000 people, that was really kind of ideal. So that was your civil community. Once you got past that threshold, you start talking about large cities, especially if they've got 1 million people. You just lose the contact, the community aspect gets lost. And those very large cities are really communities of communities. Your students would be familiar with Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods. It's tough to call Philadelphia a community. But, if you thought about breaking some of those neighborhoods down, and they had 100,000 people, 250,000 people, that was about the right scope of how the governments would have an impact on the lives of the citizens. And then it was also, Elazar was a little bit ahead of his time in terms of the 6 degrees of separation. So we all know how many degrees were separated from Kevin Bacon. That was integral to the civil community concept, that you were never 2 or 3 people removed from knowing somebody who was in city government, or who knew the mayor, or who knew council persons, or knew the president of the school board. So that was also part of the scope. So when you do some of that mathematical calculations of how far away that is and the exponent that gets involved. About 200,000, 250,000 became the number that Dan thought was the ideal size for a community.
Excellent. So we've got 40 years worth of research. He did all the original research, and might have had a research assistant, I don't know. And then after that, you helped put together the second volume, and then edited the third volume. How did you go about doing all that? How did for our students that are interested in learning how to do this, how did you set that up and get the research design off the ground?
Well, I had the great fortune of using the research design that Dr. Elazar set out. So in the first volume, he did all that research, did all the legwork, and then he essentially modified what he did, what his approach to the civil community was. And so your students will read, you do that background research, you look at the history, you review newspaper articles, you look at city council minutes, you look at school district minutes, you look at any judicial findings that may have had an impact on the city. And at that time, there would have been civil rights disputes that cities would have been dealing with, desegregating their schools, desegregating other facilities, might have been something that students would want to take a look at. And then based on kind of this understanding of what the community might be, you then start to talk to the leaders. And so in one sense, you get a sense of who the leaders are because of their position in the community. But then you look at who are the secondary leaders. And in this regard, we took the reputational approach. So, you ask a leader, well, who do you believe is a leader? Who should I contact? Who would know more about this? Who's the person that, gives you the most trouble, and the person who's most outspoken? Who's your biggest critic? And try to talk to people that way. So, because the cities that I actually studied were in Illinois, and I was living in around the Philadelphia area at the time, we had to make some of these contacts earlier. And I actually, when I conducted the research, spent 2 weeks in each of the 4 communities that I studied. So I studied Rockford, Joliet, the Quad Cities, and Springfield, Illinois. And then later I wrote on the first 3 in my dissertation because they were depressed manufacturing communities in the 1980s, and that's where I focused on. I didn't look at Springfield because it was a state capital, and it had already evolved into a service economy and had insurance companies and state government, so it never really suffered the way that the former manufacturing centers of Rockford, Joliet, and the Quad Cities suffered with regard to unemployment and challenges that they faced. So that's how I arranged it. But in the book that subsequently came out, the 3rd volume of Cities of the Prairies, I did write the chapter on Springfield as really the contrasting community to the other 3 that were really dealing with the industrial downturn or the deindustrialization of the United States at that time.
Mm-hmm. How hard is it to interpret what public officials actually tell you? I mean, I think that's one of the difficult things is that people obviously are going to have their bias and want to present a story that's good to you. How do you sift through what's true and what might be partially true and just use your judgment? How do you go about that?
Some of it is based on doing your homework beforehand so that you can ask the pointed questions. So if there's an area of dispute, and maybe it's over a zoning issue, and the city government wants to redevelop the downtown, but there's a historic preservation group that's taking them to court and preventing it. You have to know that, and you want to ask that pointed question to both sides. And just like any case, you'll get 2 sides, and then there's somewhere in the middle that's probably closer to the truth. And what we did was really just kind of document what those different interpretations were, and how you kind of piece it together, and then you're overlaying larger data sets as well. So what's going on in terms of economic impact? What's going on in terms of the demographics? Does what you're being told really jive with the reality that you're seeing? And you're not necessarily going to call someone a liar or something along that lines, but you take it with a grain of salt. I mean, you come in with a critical eye. That's our job as social scientists. That we don't just take it at face value, but we want to confirm and verify what goes on. The other thing that I found very fascinating to me, kind of coming from the East Coast and then parachuting into the Midwest, is how engaged people were to talk about their communities. Because they really, really love these communities. And kind of ask an opening question, some of the background, how did you get here? How long have you been in the community? What do you like about it? Those sorts of things. And then asking some of those pointed questions. They appreciated that I had done my homework and appreciated their community by the types of questions that were asked. So then that would help open them up. And I had one old-time politician who I tape recorded my conversation so we could transcribe them later. And he was like, you turn that thing off and I'll tell you the real story. So it was a classic caricature of a Illinois smoke-filled backroom, backslapping type of politician. And he was just a fascinating character. So it was a true learning experience, and one that I had a great deal of fun in conducting that research as well.
Excellent. Interesting. Well, do you have any final things that we might not have touched on? Any last words of wisdom you'd like to offer up?
No, I mean, it's really about identifying the communities and being respectful of those communities and the people in the communities. The ultimate goal of Cities of the Prairies and the ultimate philosophy of Dan Elazar was that social science mattered in the lives of people, and that it was our responsibility as social scientists to find and to discover, to glean the best types of public policies and make recommendations to government officials about what was in the best interest of the community. So it was one of really being a good citizen and using your academic discipline to further your citizenship.
Excellent. Well, President Marbach, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us, and thank you very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Wes, and good luck to you and your students.
Thank you.